Good morning from the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. My role will be very limited today. It's my great privilege to open this unique event, Reshaping the US-Africa Economic Relations, Perspectives and Expectations, co-organized by the Policy Center for the New South and the Atlantic Council. Before giving the floor to our other exceptional guest and a pre-recorded message of the former President of Senegal, Macky Sall, I would like just to remind that our two organizations have been partnering with each other since more than 10 years now. Thanks to the great leadership of its president, the Policy Center Executive President, Karim El Ainaoui, I'm proud he accepted to continue this partnership, and today delighted he accepted to kick off this program from Rabat in Morocco. Dr. El Ainaoui is also Executive Vice President of Mohammed VI Polytechnic University and Dean of its Humanities, Economics, and Social Sciences cluster. He is an economist who worked at the Central Bank of Morocco and at the World Bank. I recommend you to read his recent piece, Economic Development of the New South After the Washington Consensus. He is also a prominent writer and serves as advisor to the CEO and chairman of OCP Group and a board member of OCP Foundation. Karim, over to you.
Thank you, Hama, and welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Of course, we're meeting in a context, in an environment, and I'm very pleased of this partnership that we have been having with Atlantic Council over the years. It epitomizes the role of think tanks, that is to create a space for understanding, dialogue, experience sharing, and many other dimensions. So thank you, Hama, and thanks to all your colleagues for make this lively and interesting platform, but as well that is very open to others. And this is not, think tanks are not here to have proprietary knowledge, but it's really for us to share and to have dialogues. Very quickly, we're meeting in a very special environment that affects Africa, of course. We're not at the forefront of the news over the past couple of weeks. It's mostly advanced economies, but of course we are bystanders, innocent bystanders, I would say. And we are affected by ongoing events. And in particular, this is taking in a context where macroeconomic policies are under pressure because of the past scars that they carry from the various crises and the shocks that we've seen over the past couple of years. But also because of increasing economic nationalism and the consequences of industrial policies, and of course the rise of protectionism in advanced economies. So these have costs implications for the continent. Despite that, half of the 20th fastest economies in the world are in Africa. They are promising future for Africa as we're embarking into climate change in an integrated free trade area. This is not easy, this is difficult, but it is already producing some positive outcomes. What makes it difficult as well is the brain drain that's taken another dimension with organized policies in certain advanced economies, which are not without cost for the continent. And of course, with the US specifically, there's the AGOA agreement that is to be renewed in 2025, let us see. But there's also declining flows of ODA from all advanced economies, if you exclude Ukraine and support to displaced people around the world. There are questions about the future of Bretton Woods institutions. So there are many uncertain factors that are in between the relation between Morocco, the African continent in general, and advanced economies, and particularly the US. For the US in particular, foreign direct investment flows, trade flows, exchanges of services flows as well have been declining over the past 20 years. This is something to be discussed, to be taught, and to understand why it is so, and it has no reason for it to be this way. So it's something that we may want to discuss in this brief seminar and beyond, of course. So many thanks again, Rama, and to your colleagues, and for all your participants there in Washington for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. It's a true honor to count the Policy Center for the New South as a key partner of the Atlantic Council. Special thanks to your colleagues in Rabat, Zakaria Jaouri, Iman Larish, Mariam Gerari, Amal Al-Wasif, Abdelak Bassou, among others. And speaking of Rabat, we could not launch this program and hold this meeting without His Excellency Ambassador Youssef Amrani, who is here, Ambassador of the Kingdom of Morocco, an excellent friend of the Atlantic Council. Thank you, Ambassador, for gracing us with your presence and for your remarkable work for Morocco and the African continent here in Washington. Ambassador, a few days ago, Fred Kemp, you and me had the great privilege to welcome in this place a new board member of the Atlantic Council, the Atlantic Council International Advisory Board, the former president of Senegal, Macky Sall, who now lives in Morocco. Knowing this event would happen, he had the kindness to record from the boardroom just here a statement for our audience about his vision of the US-Africa economic relations. President Macky Sall.
Je suis très heureux de participer à cette rencontre très importante organisée par Atlantic Council et le Centre pour New South du Maroc pour parler des attentes des Africains face à la nouvelle administration du président Trump. Je dois dire que pour le continent africain, il serait important de présenter l'Afrique dans son visage réel, qui est un visage d'un vaste continent de 30 millions de kilomètres carrés, avec aujourd'hui une population de 1,4 milliard d'habitants, projetée à 2,5 milliards en 2050. Donc c'est un marché énorme qui, avec un partenariat diligent et gagnant-gagnant, devrait permettre de développer des opportunités, de développer de la richesse et d'avoir une prospérité partagée. Je crois que l'Afrique a des ressources importantes. L'Afrique a des défis, c'est clair. Les défis, c'est le terrorisme, c'est l'insécurité, il y a des problèmes de gouvernance. Mais si l'on considère les avantages que dont l'Afrique recèle, les ressources minérales les plus importantes, les terres rares, que ce soit les minéraux critiques, que ce soit tous les minéraux dont on a besoin pour assurer une transition énergétique, se retrouvent dans le continent. Mais nous avons besoin d'un cadre rénové qui permettra une valorisation aussi sur place, un investissement, une valeur ajoutée et des emplois. Donc c'est vraiment une opportunité et je pense que l'Amérique pourrait, dans cette nouvelle perspective, travailler avec les Africains. Et surtout, regardons le global picture, c'est-à-dire l'Afrique d'ici 20 ans, d'ici 25 ans. Ça va être nécessairement un grand partenaire et pour cela, l'Afrique peut gagner, mais l'Amérique également peut gagner. L'Afrique n'est plus dans une perspective de tendre la main. On n'est plus dans une logique d'aide publique au développement, puisque l'aide ne peut pas apporter les réponses attendues par les Africains. Parce que d'abord, l'Afrique est trop grande pour dépendre de l'aide. Sa population est trop grande et très jeune pour dépendre de l'aide. Il faut des mécanismes, il faut développer le marché des capitaux sur le continent et il faut développer des joint ventures. Et je crois que ce sera gagnant-gagnant. Voilà le message d'espoir que moi j'aimerais donner à l'endroit de la nouvelle administration Trump et le message aussi que les Africains attendent de cette administration.
Okay, with these wise words from President Sal, maybe a roadmap, I'm happy to give the mic to Ottaviano Canuto, who will moderate a unique conversation with high-profile American and African investors and experts of the African continent. Just a few words. Ottaviano is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, affiliate professor at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University, and non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institute. He is the former vice president and executive director of the World Bank, executive director at the IMF, and vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank, among other missions. Recently, he co-authored a remarkable report delivering results for the South, the Bretton Woods system, along with Hafez Ghanem, Youssef Al-Jai, and our senior fellow, Stéphane Le Boudère. I would like to say hello to him. Ottaviano, I leave you the presentation of our guest and the moderation of this long-awaited conversation in your generous hands.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, I guess they can hear me. Thank you, Ambassador. Your Ambassador, Your Excellency, Ambassador as well, and colleagues, it's a pleasure and honor to be here to discuss this, and particularly with those brilliant people here to give their take. Just for the sake of an introduction, let me maybe refer to at least 3 channels through which the new government and the United States engagement with Africa may be, to some extent, touched on in the near future. Well, one of them obviously is the trade, because foreign trade has been an arena very much full of action and promise by President Trump, and so immediately one has some curiosity about what might be the possible implications of U.S. trade policy regarding Africa. In that regard, the U.S. trade with African economies is small, and most African countries run trade deficits. So there is a lesser likelihood of, let's say, direct tariff imposition from the U.S. However, we must take into account, obviously, the potential negative growth impact from U.S. tariffs on Europe and China, and that could have an indirect impact with the trade with African economies. It comes to mind particularly the case of Gabon and Angola that run large trade surpluses with China and Europe, and they could see reduced demand. Well, about the reciprocal tariffs, they not tend to be meaningful in this case, and definitely African countries will not be probably a priority in that regard. But still on trade, we should take notes to observe that the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which has provided eligible sub-Saharan African countries, for instance, with the duty-free access to the U.S. market for over 1,800 products, and it's up for renewal this year. So it's quite important to keep the eyes on what is the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. On the financial side, of course, the decision to stop the USAID disbursements will have varying impacts on African economies. As the former president of Senegal has said, it's not all countries in Africa that have, let's say, independence, but obviously, in some special case, one thinks of South Sudan. South Sudan, the funds coming from the USAID represented nearly 16% of GDP, 4% of Central African Republic, 3.4% in Liberia, and 1.5% of Zambia. So in some cases, it is reasonably meaningful. There is also the issue of the multilateral development banks, because for instance, you think of Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Kenya. They have received increased disbursements from the World Bank in recent years. In the case of Nigeria, something close to $2.8 billion in gross disbursements last year. So as there is the executive order February 4th to review the U.S. support to all international organizations, this might have some indirect impact on World Bank and IMF, both of which provide large funding to African economies. So it's also something we paid attention to. And finally, just to refer to, as the former president related, maybe the U.S. Government will have a more proactive attitude with respect to critical minerals. And that matters dramatically for the region. To some extent, Europe and U.S. have not been as proactive in that regard as China has. So most likely, we're going to see a change in that regard. Well, we do have here a fantastic team. We have Aubrey Rabi, who's a senior advisor and senior fellow at the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. We have Brian Lenza, who's the partner in Mercury Public Affairs. With all of them, their trajectory can be found exactly in the announcement of the event. We have Amerik Sahat, the CEO of MIDA Advisors. And we have Daniel Twining, the president of International Republic Institute. This is a fantastic, superb team. Let me hand over then to Audrey. We'll try to make it short enough so as to have at least some minutes for a discussion with you and online. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Octavio. Pleasure to be here on an important topic, one that I've spent 2 decades of my life working on, which is how to deepen US-African commercial ties, investment flows, et cetera. And I can say for those of us who have a stake in this, and I think the world should, we have an uphill climb. A lot of the fundamentals have been a little bit difficult over the last few years. We've seen pretty significant devaluations in Nigeria and in Egypt, in both cases reducing profitability and investment interest from a lot of outside players. As a result of those, we've seen major US exits of multinationals. In Nigeria, you can count Procter & Gamble, P&G left after almost 3 decades. You've seen a little bit of the stalling of some of the projects that were announced during COVID to invest, say, in Kenya, Moderna, in vaccine productions. So you see multinational, Western multinational interests decreasing. Meanwhile, the venture space, which was one of the highlights, has kind of leveled out at about 2.2 billion in FDI every year. So we have kind of a fundamental challenge of low investor interest relative to other regions. There are some, outstanding opportunities. Morocco's attracted a lot of investment globally, as has Egypt. If you look at the 160+ billion that was attracted last year in FDI in the continent as a whole, Egypt and Morocco and Mauritania constitute the most. And of that, UAE has emerged as a major investor. The UAE project in Mauritania at 30-some billion in renewables is the largest of last year. So what that means is we need to work together to figure out new ways and new avenues. One that I'm most bullish on is in the critical mineral space, just because you've seen the emergence of critical mineral diplomacy in this Trump administration. Ukraine is a case in point. You also have a lot of very clear ways to articulate the mutual overlap of interests between the United States and African countries. Obviously, it's an area where Africa's riches and endowments meet global demand. So it's an area we're bullish on. We've started a critical minerals task force here at the Atlantic Council. It's about 1.5 years old now. And we're looking at ways to deepen investment along that vector. Likewise, you'll see a lot of interest still in the data center and connectivity space. So IT remains a big area. So Starlink can't even meet demand in the region, the data centers, et cetera. So those are the 2 sectors I'm most bullish on.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Aubrey. Brian?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here. Yeah, I always tell people, the way the President Trump, looks at Africa is a chessboard. And who's across the chessboard from him? Some people are going to say Democrats, some people are going to say Russia, some people are going to all the other actors. But to make it simple terms, President Trump sees China across the chessboard from him. And in the chessboard, Africa is a significant piece of whatever success the Americans want to have, the United States wants to have, as it sort of moves forward in the energy transition, as it moves forward to look at economic growth. Africa becomes a big component as we try to counter these things. And in fact, if you look at it under the lens of, you brought up Ukraine, Aubrey, rare earth minerals is top of mind. That is the clearest example of the role that Africa is going to play in this Trump administration and how it sees it. It sees across itself, on the chessboard from China. It sees resources in Africa. It sees resources in other countries, and it's going to, for the first time ever, it's going to, leverage the government to try to sort of go and seek those resources in a collaborative way. When you see what's going on in the Ukraine side is for the first time ever, the U.S. is creating a fund. Sort of a stand-up fund to deal with the excesses of the revenue that comes in, the profits of the revenues. So they're looking at the model differently than they've ever looked at it before. And I think that's an important thing to understand, and that's the leverage that Africa has, is you now have the resources. You've always had the resources, but you now have the urgency of those resources, and now you have an administration that's creating whole new models that have never existed on how to leverage those resources. And Ukraine is just one example. That's month one. And so you're going to have multiple examples of this administration looking and leveraging it in new ways that we've never seen it before. Democrats certainly have never done the fund. Republicans have never done these funds. And these things are going to be apparatuses that tie us more closer economically. And I think from President Trump's standpoint, if he is across the chessboard from China, it's critical for him to have Africa as a key chess piece on the board with him. And so you're going to see more and more of those opportunities to take place. You're right, it's gone, it's been tough. Several years, but I think with this administration, as he sees it in more blunt ways, and he's less of the diplomat and more of the businessman. It's like, what do we need to do? What red tape can we cut through to make sure that we're having the conversations that we need to be having with these African countries? That it's not about other things that are going to take priorities. It's going to be about the economic relationships that we can have that rises both boats up. And so, I'm excited with this administration and how it sort of sees, how government can work differently with Africa. I think the continent itself has a tremendous amount to offer, and I think these individual countries, are a much stronger leveraging point with, at least with the Trump administration, than they ever were with Biden. Biden cared, and he showed it. But I think Trump looks at it as a leverage play of me competing against China. And I think the previous administration looked at it in a different lens. And I think the leverage play creates a much stronger opportunity for Africa. So I'm excited. And hopefully, we all get to play a small role. But I think it's safe to say, in Trump's eyes, Africa has arrived and he's ready to work with him.
All right. Perfect. Thank you, Brian. Hey, Medic.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank the Ambassador Rama for this invitation. Regards to my friend, Ambassador Chris Karubia from Kenya, who's here today. So for MEDA advisors, we focus on the investment side. We were initially set up in 2016, actually through a collaboration with the U.S. Agency for International Development. But our focus was not aid. It was about investments and trade. Our mandate was to help bring significant investments in Africa through partnerships with U.S. pension funds, foundations, endowments. And the reason for that is because ultimately the U.S. does not have the major public banks that the Chinese have to deploy into major infrastructure investments in Africa. So the tool that we have is our U.S. financial markets, our U.S. banks, our U.S. pension funds, our U.S. foundations to also invest in Africa's critical infrastructure space. The Government Accountability Office actually published a report just 2 months ago that showed that between 2013 and 2022, China deployed $680 billion in major infrastructure projects across the Global South. The US, throughout the same period, only deployed about $76 billion. And if you look at the Chinese investments, it was $250 billion in the energy space, $200 billion in transport, connecting markets to China, and another $200 billion in mining and industries. There was a $26 billion in communications, so setting up data centers and networks, connecting it through the Chinese standards and technologies. During this time, the US only invested about $76 billion. So we don't have the same tools that the Chinese have. So we need to be very smart about using what we have, which is financial markets, capital markets, instruments that the DFC can offer, such as guarantees, insurance, to help our investors invest in Africa's space. And that's the work that we've been doing over the last 8 years. We've deployed over $1 billion in collaboration with the DFC by leveraging US investors to invest in housing, in infrastructure. We're looking at mining, we're looking at data centers as well. So for our perspective, we're hoping that not aid, but trade and investments is the focus going forward. We're hoping that we have the tools at DFC, at US Exim Bank, to allow us to de-risk these transactions, deal with risk, currency risk as well, as you stated, Aubrey, but also to ensure that our investors are able to learn about these markets, are able to penetrate these markets, are able to compete, and ultimately are able to invest. We know that there are some very significant and profitable investments you can make in Africa, and we're hoping that with this administration, as we were able to do, I would say in the first Trump administration, we were able to do a lot of transactions in Africa. We're hoping that we can do more. So I'll pause here for now.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amiri. So, Daniel, please.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and our friends at the Atlantic Council. A lot of ground's been covered. Let me just make a couple extra points. The first is that this really could be an African century. It's a historic opportunity for us all, for Africans, but for all of us. 1 in 4 members of the global labor force, the largest proportion of young people in the world. This is an extraordinary opportunity, including for business and development. We should seize it. What does that look like? There are some upside possibilities and also some great risks. Maybe I'll start with the risks so that I can end optimistically. The Sahel has become the epicenter of global Islamic extremism, right? This year, this is quite extraordinary. Almost 22,000 deaths in the Sahel. The most lethal terrorist organizations in the world are operating out of West Africa. It's quite astonishing to me. I grew up in West and Central Africa, including the Sahel. The Sahel in the 1980s felt like about the safest place in the world. This is a great danger, primarily to Africans, but also to the world when that extremism is exported. We also know that there is gross corruption and misgovernance that is holding back development and opportunities, the former president of Senegal said. I know from running a democracy institute that investors have come to us and said, you know what, where there's good government and rule of law and transparency and property rights, I make a lot of money. Therefore, I want to support your work in Africa to help establish essentially the governance infrastructure for development and growth. It's actually quite strategic for us to invest in this. I'm all for everything everyone has proposed. We're never going to match China dollar for dollar in terms of state resources. What can we do when we think about the infrastructure of Africa for growth and development? We can actually invest in this government infrastructure, governance, that includes anti-corruption measures, transparency, legislative oversight, strong civil societies, free media that can hold leaders accountable. In African countries that have this, governance has produced actually quite striking development and growth. Let's invest in that. Let's also think about how we compete with China. China can come in and do corrupt deals with dictators, right? Those corrupt deals are much harder to do when citizens can hold governments accountable, when leaders have to answer to legislatures, when media can report on the transactions, when there are open tenders, public procurement, when there is rule of law, when there are secure property rights. All these things actually are what produce growth and broad-based prosperity. China is not interested in investing in them, but I think we in the United States can be and should be, and I know we're joined by Africans, because every time I go to the continent, I hear, you know what, we're the most pro-democracy people in the world. Look at the Afrobarometer polls, right? Africans are more pro-democracy and freedom than people in any other part of the world. Arguably, they've had the least successful and effective democratic governance, right, over the past period, for all sorts of reasons. Let's help young Africans not have corrupt, extractive governments. Let's help them have governments that want to grow and develop and include them in that growth and development story. Otherwise, they will be drawn to the extremist groups. Otherwise, they will be tempted to migrate for opportunity. I certainly would if I were a young man living in the Sahel, right? So let's help them stay home and prosper and succeed and live in well-governed societies. That has extraordinary implications for us in terms of trade and investment opportunities, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's this giant rising consuming class, whatever it is, Africa should be actually the most amazing development story of the 21st century if we can get this governance infrastructure right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Well, before we go to, let me give an opportunity for our colleagues here to comment, to say something now that you all heard from each other.
I'll just say a few words. One, I don't see the U.S. Being very, let's just say, credible in the moment of preaching a democracy or governance story in African markets. I think we're going through our own challenges in governance. And I think the view of being front and center talking about values is not what this administration is going to do. I think it is taking, in fact, a learning out of the Chinese playbook and looking at some of the deals. I mean, if you look what's being discussed in Ukraine right now, it's not unlike a lot of the deals that the Chinese have been doing across African markets for the last 2 decades. So I think we're just broadening the kind of lens over what is possible, like Brian said, in terms of what kind of deals can come. And I don't think going front forward with a kind of governance or democracy is going to be what this administration does, nor do I think it would be very taken well in African markets. In fact, I think the way they're looking at governance of some of their natural resources is much more akin in the Middle East and the Gulf. And we're, in fact, at the Africa Center right now, we have a paper under works about the African mechanisms for managing their own resources, looking at the case of Senegal and Botswana, et cetera. So I think that they'll look internally and externally for natural resource management along, good governance lines, keeping the resources for the future. I do think I want to bring on 2 points that Imeric brought up, which is just what tools we have. Everyone knows we're in DFC reauthorization period. It has to be reauthorized by October. It is a fundamental piece or a core piece of our commercial diplomacy toolbox. And until we really amp it up and or make a sovereign wealth fund, there's a period of time which we don't have the tools that we necessarily need. And then secondly, US Exim Bank goes into reauthorization next year. And so we have kind of a 2-year intense period of looking at the tools that we have. And then lastly, we have AGOA is coming up for renewal this year. So in this milieu, we have to engage Congress as well, because they are going to be key players in ensuring that we have the right tools to bear. Because I think for a long time what we did was we improved our tools in the first Trump administration, meaning DFC became reality, OPIC, XM became alive again. We have these new tools, but we didn't know what to build with those tools. We didn't know where to direct them. Maybe libido was an example, but we didn't really have, okay, now we have all these shiny tools, what are we going to do with them? I think this administration will be more focused on what to do with the tools once we have them, if we can get through these legislative hurdles quite quickly.
Can I just respond to that? I mean,
Yes.
Look, I'm a realist. I want to deal with the world as it is. I will tell you, though, that American investors are going to make money in markets like Ghana and Kenya and South Africa that are well-governed, that have effective courts, et cetera, et cetera. I don't actually think we beat China by playing by Chinese rules, right? Of course, we're not going to go in and do corrupt dealings. We're not going to go in and bribe politicians. I would like something maybe in between, kind of a Chinese kind of pure transactionalism, and something that actually speaks to our comparative advantage, which is that young Africans want to live in non-corrupt modern societies. And I think we can be very workmanlike and pragmatic about that. Please don't confuse me for some starry-eyed idealist. There is a way to build into, for instance, the DFC dealings, forms of accountability and transparency that actually play to American strengths, not the strengths of Chinese businesses and investors, the strengths of American businesses and investors. So I will second your point about dealing with the Africa as it is. but I'm saying let's play to our strengths. I would also like to just amplify how important AGOA is, how important some of the other instruments are. We work with African militaries all over the world. Let's keep doing that. We actually have Kenyan peacekeepers in Haiti right now helping us sort out a hot mess in that country, which is very close to our own. Let's help invest in building capacity across the board in African countries so that they can be better partners to the United States.
And Merrick.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to hear them both because it just shows how confusing the space is right now. I'm actually returning back to Africa tomorrow, and I don't know what the message is because I don't have the tools right now because we don't know where they're going to go. Certainly, we're getting signs that the DFC is going to be stronger and more effective, and we're hoping for that. U.S. aid is obviously gone at the moment. Exim Bank, we're waiting for that reauthorization. The U.S. model, we don't know what it means now. Is it all business, and less governance? It's not really known. I'm not sure where our credibility stands with a lot of African governments. And we have live transactions as we speak. And we don't know how to move forward, at least for the next few months. But what we are hoping for is that DFC is a lot stronger. We're hoping that there is more flexibility around the tools. Because, under Biden, the tools were there. They were not always as effective, and there were a lot of constraints around how to use those tools. We're hoping that they're going to remove those constraints, and we're hoping that the DFC is a lot bigger and more effective. We are concerned about staffing and capacity, particularly at some of these agencies, because you may authorize a lot more in terms of capacity, financial capacity, but if the staffing is not there, then we're going to go from an average of 2 years to make a major deal to maybe 5 years.
Or it's going to be bigger deals, right, Emmerich? Because they're going to just do bigger deals.
And bigger deals.
And bigger deals don't do well for Africa always, because often the money chunk and the opportunity chunk don't match in the Africa case. Unless we do large, if you look at, for example, the deal that was done by DFC 10 days ago, they did $600 million into Orion, which is a mining fund in New York. Maybe those diversified plays can touch Africa deals in the end with large ticket size, but it's going to take people like you in order to kind of structure that, to make sure that the global plays have an Africa subcomponent.
Yeah.
Right, so you have to be very smart in how do you manage the next 3 months or so.
3 months, maybe.
Ryan?
I would add, I think the important theme to tell, when you go back to Africa and try to explain the U.S., or at least President Trump's U.S., is that it's now transactional. And that things that were not on the table or perceived to be on the table 2 months ago with respect to financing, with respect to leverage, with respect to all of these components, it's now transactional. And that means a lot of things to a lot of people, but what Trump means, it means economic activity. And, and he's put people in these departments who come from the finance world, who know speed matters. What kills all deals? Time. And so I think you have an administration who's business orientated, not political. You see it every day that they're not political, and that's okay. But from the business standpoint, is they are there to execute. They understand that sometimes with business that you have failures, but you learn from those things and you get better and you keep trying. And I think that's the most important thing that I would tell anybody who's sort of trying to understand Trump and what this new term is going to be. It's different for you. It's different for Americans, don't get me wrong. But it is now a transactional administration, and everything's on the table. And you're seeing rare earth minerals, the key component to ending a war in Ukraine, Russia. And by the way, some of those mines, they're in Russian territory.
Yeah. If I may ask, you all referred to, one way or another, to the transaction approach by President Trump. And it has been consistent in that regard. So far, at least, the only country that has faced increase in tariffs is China. The whole thing with Canada and Mexico, and it sounds like it's going to be the same with the European Union and so on, is transactional, as Secretary Scott Bassett had alluded to before even the beginning of the government. Now, how would that translate in the case of Africa? And let me also make a remark, if I may. Look, the presence of China through the Belt and Road was, to a large extent, the occupation of an empty space. that has been left by retrenchment of multilateral institutions. And as you know, I'm Brazilian, and as we all, whenever the Republicans came or the Democrats came to Latin American countries to say, look, watch out for the Chinese. These guys are after, to trap you in a debt. And then the answer by the authority was always, okay, so what do you propose in place? And the same thing applies in the case of Africa. With the difference that as of now, we don't have anymore the USAID. And second, even the multilateral development banks are, at peril. So how would, let's say, a more proactive attitude taken by the U.S. government with respect to those items materialize in our case? If it's a bit provocative, but
Listen, I can jump in there, Octavio. I think there's two ways. And Aymeric is exactly right. We were never going to do it the same way the Chinese are. Even if you learn from their model, we don't necessarily have the right tools or the system, a centralized system that works as it is. So there's two avenues. One is modeled by Libido Corridor. Okay, so you take a big project of some sort. So I'll call it the flagship project model. And, Trump could look at two other corridors that are anchored, say, in, a particular mineral. It could be uranium or whatever. And you build around it, and then you have DFC and XM, and you use the tools focused on that flagship project. The other is what I alluded to before, which is taps into something Aymeric and I've talked about many times. It taps into our capital markets. Our strength is the size and the liquidity and the depth of our capital markets. Therefore, our pension funds, our institutional investors, large players. Now, they haven't moved money en masse to African markets because of a lack of diversification and the right size of vehicles. So what you could see on the other side, and these things don't have to be, they can happen, at the same time, simultaneously, is you would have money coming in from a future US sovereign wealth fund or from a DFC into large, diversified global vehicles that invest along a certain sector and have African opportunities within their pipeline. So an example is DFC did a fund called TechMet. TechMet is diversified player. They invest in mining projects all over the world. They have some in the US. They have some in the UK. They have some they have some in Norway, right? They also have one in Rwanda and in South Africa. So you see those type of plays that then can raise large capital from the US capital markets, don't need US government once they've been de-risked, and continue to channel capital in. So those are the two avenues that I see, but we're never going to be the same where we come in with rail or roads. We don't build those things in our own country. It's gonna take us how many years to rebuild the Baltimore Bridge? I mean, this is not what we're best at.
Yeah.
Listen, I think you're right, Aubrey, in the sense that the U.S. is not looking to build a tremendous amount of infrastructure like the Chinese were doing. I think the model for them works, as you said, these big landmark projects and sort of build out from that. And that's a model that President Trump understands, and it's a model that can move rather easy. Sort of the second model gets a little bit more complicated because there's a heck of a lot more moving parts. Right. You don't want to complicate it with President Trump or his administration. These are business people. They want to think linear. What do we need to get the deal done? So here's the marquee location. You need all these other things built out. I think you'll have success a lot faster than round two.
Yeah, but a Lutnick, for example, coming from a Cantor, or you look at Ben Black coming into DFC.
Absolutely.
They're going to deeply understand large capital pools and asset managers. Right. And those guys, once they get confirmed in office, I think can help drive those strategies of the more diversified player. Otherwise, we'll never tap into our capital markets.
Yeah. And if I may add, that's exactly why we are excited about what is taking place, because we know that the model that they understand quite well and that they have used is exactly this capital markets approach. And the people that they are putting in these institutions, even in Ukraine, if you see actually what they're proposing, it's really a capital markets approach. So I think for us, doing major financing of infrastructure in Africa, we're quite excited about what we could potentially do with this administration. We think that they are better positioned to understand how we can compete, because previously we talked a lot about competing, but nothing really happened. If you look at the numbers, it was really not significant. So I think they are serious about competing. I think they understand how they can use the strengths we have in the U.S. to compete. And actually, we think that we can be quite innovative to make a significant difference with this administration. So from our perspective, in the space that we operate, we're quite optimistic about what could be unleashed in the next couple of years.
Great. Daniel.
I would just add, we need to raise awareness, including of Congress, in these amazing opportunities, right? This field is wide open for U.S. leadership and engagement and deal-making. So far, the conversation has revolved around, as you suggested, tariffing Canada, Mexico, the EU, Japanese steel, right? Let's broaden the lens and let's talk about some opportunity, including for the United States, and that has to involve the U.S. Congress. People are also just focused, when we think about great power competition, they're very focused on the key theaters, right? The Middle East, Europe, East Asia, Indo-Pacific. Let's just get people excited about Africa and these possibilities. This is a great group to do it.
Fantastic. We do have a small window for any question, comment. Yes, please. We have the mic there. And please ask just to introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I don't know if our online audience.
That's
can,
right.
though.
We want you to be listened by the online audience, if I may.
When you're short, they don't see you when you stand up. It's okay, be short. Anyway, when I come to this group, I hear Aubrey speak. Aubrey is kind of the voice of transactional arrangements well before President Trump, before discussing it. So I listen. I'm not a speaker, so I'm going to limit my comments to 3 minutes since I worked in this field, Steve Lanning, Manchester trade, for 60 years, so I won't bore you. This is a new administration. Get used to it. Mr. Trump believes in transactions. We saw what he did in Ukraine. That's going to be an agreement. You saw what he did in the Middle East, started a whole new debate. It's going to be an agreement. What he's now talking about is transactional approach. That's forget about your general principles. It's getting the U.S. companies, U.S. individuals involved. He can mobilize that. Forget about government institutions are important, but they'll work. I don't care about that. So what I'm saying in short is my own view has been we need to have a billionaire who is dedicated to Africa. A perfect example is somebody named Steve Schwarzman, who runs Blackstone Group, knows Africa, knows President Trump very close. I'm not sure he's the right name. But as soon as he puts a businessman in that place, you will see the deals develop. Thank you very much for a few seconds to speak.
Right, thank you.
We have the ambassador.
Yes, Ambassador. Here, we got here.
In front.
In front.
First, good morning, and to Atlantic Castle, thank you very much for the invite and for bringing such an outstanding panel in front of us. Let me start here about first, number one. By the way, I'm Ambassador Christopher Kirigwa. I'm the DCM for Kenya and also the National Treasury Chief Representative here in the US. A career banker, and that's why I met Americ. Let me say this. Let me start here first. I think we downplay the investments from the US into Africa, and it's because we don't quantify that well.
Yeah.
And I'll start here, number one. The US is the largest Eurobond investor.
That's right.
In the capital markets, in all Eurobond issuances.
Yeah.
Now, you look at the play of how we look at what is the US investment in Africa. 60% of most of the Eurobonds in Africa,
That's right.
that comes from the US. Now, the difference between the other side of the coin you're talking about is that they fund projects directly. So they're able to say that we did a train worth $2 billion. For every $2 billion investment in a Eurobond, 60% of that is $1.2 billion. Yeah? So there's enough scale already going from the US, but it's not quantified into projects because Eurobonds go directly into the government's, what do you call this? To the Treasury, which is allocated how the Treasury wishes to allocate it. Now, in Africa, there's a big thing, I'll say this. First, number one is the opportunity. The opportunity is large. Yeah. I think it's the largest opportunity in the entire world. Now, in Americ's point of view, is financing the challenge? The answer is no. The biggest challenge that we face in Africa that projects don't get, that do not attract the investment, is the development. The initial development on all projects is a real work, not funding the project. If we're able to prepare good structured, well-structured projects that demonstrate the outcome for investors, the flows will go into those projects. Yeah? And actually, what I view is what the current administration is doing is looking exactly towards that. Which are the projects that will make investors money for them to put their money towards to? Now, Africa, it's a huge continent with very many countries. Yeah. So the only way you look at, if you look at one small country, I'll just use Kenya for example, right? If you look at a project just in Kenya, a lot of investors will tell you a $1 billion project is too small. The only way you can look at Africa as a significant opportunity is you create projects that can easily be replicated. So when you look at a project in Kenya that you can say, for example, let me just use even smaller numbers. You look at a $500 million project, yeah, that you can replicate 10 times. That's $5 billion. Mm-hmm. It's sizable in any economy that you look at. So investors will be attracted as long as they know, first, number one, you can do a good structure. And obviously, I don't downplay the issues you talked about governance. Yeah, I'll not downplay that, but I'm also a banker. If you bring in the capital markets, you bring in the international financial sector, governance will be followed. Yeah. So financing is not a challenge, and also now there also are tools which have been available for very long, which is, for example, USTDA. Mm-hmm. Wow. USTDA has a lot of money for project development. Yeah. But before you put in a project for project development, bankers have the thumbs. What do you call? You can tell from the beginning if a project will attract private sector capital or not. Yeah. So I think one aspect that we need to look at is how do we create a pipeline of projects that can go to the end? Because I can tell you the majority of the projects which are developed, I can say this. I used to run public-private partnerships for the Kenya government. It is not. Most of the projects, if you leave it to how would I put it? Let me look for diplomatic word. If you leave it just to the, Trump uses that word a lot actually. If you leave it just to the people in government.
Bureaucracy.
It's actually, bureaucracy, I like the word bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is used for a good reason, to protect public funds. But if you leave it just to the public sector, you'll not be able to select projects. So public sector and government, collaboration and partnership needs to work. Yeah. Those two sides, by the way, of the coin, in any part of the world, don't trust each other. Yeah. So the public and private have to work to get each other to scale up projects. Lastly, opportunities. There are significant opportunities in infrastructure, financial sector, and now the last one part you talked about is data centers and digital across Africa, which can significantly be replicated. Thank you. Thank you. And apologies for taking so long.
Thank you, Excellence. Good, excellent point. We're running out of time. So may I ask you guys to give your final take, to the extent of possible?
I'll do it quickly. Thank you, Ambassador, for bringing up the capital markets in terms of Eurobonds. People always have a misperception. They say the number one financier of infrastructure in Africa is China. No, it's African governments themselves. And they're doing that in part through Eurobonds. But it's indirect and it's more difficult to see and it's not coordinated by the US government, right? So it's not a tool of foreign policy in the same way that we're now thinking of these things. Two, you see an emergence of opportunities. For example, the Congolese, DRC, President Tshisekedi talked about a critical minerals deal with the US. There's no meat on it yet that I've seen, but there's something on the table. To Steve's point, I do think business linkages directly, both ways. You talked about a potential like US billionaire getting involved, but it can go the other way. There are going to be African billionaires who invest directly in processing in the United States, and that's going to be very meaningful. They can say, we'll cut out the Chinese middlemen, and we'll invest, we own minerals in Africa, we'll invest in the United States, we'll capture the entire value chain, right? That strategy will be really compelling in this era. So I agree that there's a lot of opportunity during this period. We just have to ride out the uncertainty in the short term.
Fantastic.
I'll be quick. I'm excited about the U.S.-Africa relationship going forward. There's just a tremendous amount of opportunities, and under sort of this new lens of President Trump and how he brings his business approach, and everything's on the table as we're seeking leverage points and points of agreement. I think that's going to benefit a lot of African countries, and it's going to benefit the U.S.
Right.
Thanks. I'm excited as well. I'm looking forward to the new tools that are going to be provided by this administration. I'm excited about the approach they're taking as well. And I think it's time for also Africa to be ready for a partnership on investments and trade.
Great.
I like this idea of a public-private partnership to produce a prosperity agenda. And I do think that's a good way to come at it, following your lead, Ambassador. That does implicate governance for sure, but it very much suggests a partnership that the private sector brings so much to the table. Let's help governments create an enabling environment for this prosperity to flow, and let's have America take an active role in this, not simply leave it to the private sector.
Great. Aubrey, Brian, Americ, Daniel, thank you very much. I guess you have given us a very rich kickstart, because obviously this issue deserves to be revisited and sometime soon, so as to fill the blanks on many of the questions that left here. But that the idea exactly to start up, this kind of discussion. I also want to thank you all for being here, the inputs given to the discussion, and also to raise, the due attention to the fruitfulness of this partnership between the Africa Center of the Atlantic Dialogues and the Atlantic Council and the Policy Center for the New South. It's a very fertile when it comes to studies, reports, and discussions and debates. That's the main role of think tanks that we are. So thank you very much on behalf of the Policy Center for this partnership. Thank you all. Until our next one. Thank you.
Thank you.